Hello, it's me, Anita, again. And in this video, I would like to continue with my discussion on dysphoria. In the first video, I did sort of an overview of my understanding of dysphoria in terms of gender identity, specifically, and broke it into really four different areas. The physical, which most people tend to think of as the dysphoria, emotional, social, and spiritual. And in the last video, part two, and I'll try to link those somewhere in here, uh, then I discussed more from a personal perspective my struggles with physical and emotional dysphoria. And in this video, I'd like to continue that conversation and talk about the social and spiritual dysphoria. Now, I've talked a lot about both of those, and um, and so there's going to be a little bit of overlap with the other two videos, and I'm going to change the focus a little bit from what I did before. So, with the social dysphoria, I talked a lot about already about the feeling of loneliness, of not feeling like I fit in anywhere, wanting to be with girls, but the social, cultural norms at the time said no unless you have some overriding reason to do so, and I sort of found a way to do that. But, and then I talked about really feeling very secretive, feeling cut off from people, and I want to go back to that a little bit because one of the things that I discovered especially as I started understanding who I really was and trying to come to grips with that, was that I had been throughout my life very sensitive to how other people responded to me. And I felt a lot of need to kind of control their response. And this grew out a lot of this grew out of that sense of secretiveness. I've talked about having a secret that even I didn't know, but I had to keep everybody else from knowing. And that then just makes one hyper aware of what other people are thinking about you, how other people are responding to you. And there's this real sense of trying to control what other people, what other people are thinking and doing. And so I struggled a lot with that, mostly on an unconscious level. It wasn't one of those things I did consciously, but it was constant. It was always there, and I was always attuned to it. There's always this low-level anxiety that's part of. When I talked about it in the discerning video, that was part of the thing is that there's always this low-level anxiety that I never could quite get my hands on and understand. It didn't seem to have any real cause. When I went through therapy the first time, there really wasn't a sense of, oh, we understand why that's there. But as I've sort of started to understand this a little bit more, and I'll talk about it from there, that hyper awareness really served to keep me from stepping out of bounds, if you will. There'd be situations where I really quite wouldn't know what to do, and I'd be really aware. I'd really listen to what other people were doing and try to mimic that as much as possible. And so there's a real sense of being inauthentic, but at the same time, there's this real sense of, well, there's this overriding need to keep something secret. As I've started my transition, as I've come through this, one of the things I've discovered is that there's this immense relief of being freed from that need to be that sensitive to what other people are saying. But on the other hand, as I've been around people who are trying to be accepting, trying to be supportive of me, they're saying things to me that I found very problematic. And in particular, it's centered around the fact that I I had male pattern baldness. I shaved my head because I just couldn't stand to see the male pattern baldness anymore. I'd rather not have any hair at all than have to deal with the male pattern baldness. And there were a lot of people very well intentioned, and I tried to take their comments as being supportive, but the the core of it was, oh, you would look better, you'd look more like a woman if you had hair. If you get a wig, you should get a wig because it will help you be accepted. And I want to talk about that just a little bit here in terms of the social dysphoria, because I think the social dysphoria gives us, at least for me as a transgender person, a sensitivity in that statement that I can see the idea of being supportive, but at the same time, it carries that weight of I've exchanged one set of trying to live up to somebody's expectations with another set of trying to live up to somebody's expectations. And I've taken the risk of social ostracization, of losing my lifelong friends. That's a risk that every transgender person takes. You don't know how other people are going to respond necessarily when you come out. You hope they respond well, and I was extremely fortunate, and almost everybody did. And but you're taking that risk. You're taking that struggle, and when you finally get free, you find yourself. I mean, part of the reason for doing that is this freedom from having to be hyper aware about how other people are reacting to you, and finally being able to be really relaxed and be yourself with other people. And actually, one of the things I've gotten feedback for since I've come out at church is that people have come up to me and said, you seem much more relaxed, you smile more frequently. They were able to see that this has been a very positive move for me. And it's part of the reason why I know that most of these comments are meant to be very supportive and understanding, but from my perspective, it feels like, oh, here's this other set of expectations that comes down on top of you, and you have to live up to this set of expectations. And that's very difficult to hear when you've finally gone through trying to free yourself from having to be hyper aware about other people's expectations. And part of the struggle that we have with the social dysphoria, and I'm going to include these feelings as part of the social dysphoria, is that how are we supposed to be? Who are we supposed to be as a woman? There's a certain sense that who you are is, for me at least, who I am is heavily mediated by how I react to other people, how I interact with other people, but also how they interact with me. And that struggle is still going on. It's gotten better. I feel much more centered. I feel, like I said, in the past, I feel much more myself. I feel much more spontaneous. I feel much more authentic. But there's still this sense of trying to figure out who I am as a social person. One of the things I have discovered in doing this transition is that before I always wanted to limit conversation, and I always wanted to get out of conversations, especially face-to-face conversations, because they always had some level of a danger to them. There's always this possibility that I was going to slip up, I was going to say something, and somebody was going to realize. I've talked in the past about, or in the other videos, about really feeling that people are going to discover who, I'm a terrible person, I'm a horrible person. And so I really limited that. Now I don't have that fear. I don't have that anxiety. I'm able to be a lot more open, a lot more myself. I'm able to enjoy conversations with other people. I'm not having to monitor. I'm not having to worry about saying the wrong thing. I already know what the secret is. I've let other people know what the secret is. That's no longer an issue. I'd like to move on then to spiritual dysphoria. I don't have a whole lot more to add about this. I've talked a little bit about it. I do want to talk about my own faith journey. I grew up in a more liberal denomination. that, especially in the areas where we were located, but I also grew up in a very conservative religious area. So even though we were more liberal, we were still fairly conservative. It's like being on the liberal into the conservative spectrum, if you will. And certainly the culture as a whole that I grew up in was very religiously conservative. It was very heavily geared towards the atonement theology. You're going to go to hell if you don't do certain things. You only go to heaven if you believe in Jesus. And what does that really mean? And so I was exposed secondhand to a lot of really bad theology. I was fortunate enough to have grandparents who had been missionaries in China. My mother was actually born in China to them, and then had come back at a young age from China. And his understanding of theology and the way he taught her, brought her up, was a much more progressive form of theology. I think his time in China had really sort of opened his eyes to some of the beliefs there. I think he'd been open to sort of more of an interaction. I certainly got that feeling from him later in life. And my mother had grown up then with a very questioning attitude. She didn't sort of accept the standard theological stuff that they give you when you go to church. And there really is. There's kind of a common theology that most people expect when they go to church, and ministers try to give that. But there is a more questioning theology, which some people have, and my mother had that, and she read a lot of theologians. And she and I would talk from time to time about certain theological things, especially as I got older. And I also had to deal with this from the perspective of, I talked in the last video about having had this illness when I was in my 20s that almost killed me, that by all rights probably should have killed me. But I had major surgery done, but in terms of dealing with that, it was about a 3.5-year period where I was chronically ill, and actually even with the surgery there was this sense of, well, we'll alleviate the immediate crisis, but you're still going to be sick, and you're still going to have to deal with this chronic illness for the rest of your life. And so it raises this whole issue of, well, is this a punishment from God? Is this, you get a lot of things that come back from sort of the traditional religious perspective that frankly I had a hard time dealing with. And so I've dealt with a lot of these things simply because that was problematic. And to start understanding that illness not as something that God was giving me as a punishment, but just as another path. That here is another path that I've, that's part of God's creation that I'm on, and God's desire for me is how I interact with the people I meet. That the path itself doesn't make a whole lot of difference. That on all paths, it's really how you deal with the other people. It's how all paths just give you insight into different types of people. I had a lot more insight into people who are ill, who are chronically ill, who are going through serious illnesses that otherwise I would have never. I was exposed to a lot of hospital personnel that dealt on a daily basis with very difficult cases. Again, people that normally I wouldn't have interacted with. And I sort of came up with that that basic understanding of my relationship with God. And that actually helped me enormously as I continued forward, because it gave me something to sort of focus on. And while I struggled with my own sense of spirituality, I never considered myself a terribly spiritual person. And yet I kept finding myself put into spiritual leadership roles, people responding to me as though I was very spiritual, people asking me to teach because I was very analytical, and working with kids because I really enjoyed it and became sort of a nice way of doing that. And now I kind of understand why I was one of the few men that actually spent a lot of time with the children, and really enjoyed the children. And so it ends up being one of these things where I always struggled with this. What was my relationship with God? But at the same time, I had this idea of, well, okay, this is like how I relate to other people, and trying to be supportive of them and trying to be open to them is really what God is asking me to do. And so the rest of it, yeah, we'll do what we can. But there's always a sense of having to somehow do something to gain God's acceptance. And the whole idea of grace, that God loves us, and He's we're accepted no matter what. It's one of those things where I go, yeah, okay, I can understand that, I can see the logic of it, but yeah, it never really connected with me on an emotional basis. Coming out though, and starting to understand that I'm transgender and understanding who I actually am, again, this is one of those things where when I hit that, it wasn't, oh, I'm sinful, I'm a terrible person, but I already had those theological grounds to go, oh, this is just another path. It's like the illness before, except that this isn't really an illness. It's actually getting well from an illness, if you will, if you want to think of the psychological defenses that I had before as being the illness. It's like getting well, and all of a sudden but it's a different path, and I've met people on this path that I would have never met before. I've been blessed in a way that I've never been, blessed before, and so again, to look at this as part of the changes that are necessary for this path. And the spiritual dysphoria, I hope this helps give a sense of what that spiritual dysphoria actually does in terms of really inhibiting or possibly inhibiting your ability to really accept what's been taught to you religiously, and especially if you haven't had the background that at least I was fortunate enough to have of a very questioning approach to religions and religious beliefs. I would like to move on to transphobia, and the next I may do. I'm sort of thinking about doing something a little more fluffy for the next video. I haven't quite decided what it's going to be yet, but I do want to talk about transphobia, and I want to sort of delay some more of this conversation until I get into that video, because again, the transphobia, and especially the internalized transphobia, is an important aspect to remember or to understand. But thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been good for you. I hope this whole conversation on dysphoria has been useful, and it helped you understand what I've gone through and maybe what other transgender people are going through. Please subscribe. I will try to put my beautiful picture somewhere up in this area, and also please link to or please look at the whole playlist I have on my journey, which I'll try to link sort of over my right shoulder. But to help, because I think those will help you understand if you haven't watched those already. But thank you again very much for watching this, and I hope this has been useful.